was your initiative. And to me personally, this is the first online book launch. I've never done this in my life before. I feel under a lot of pressure that I have to be super fast, although this is basically an extremely pleasurable moment when I need to say thank you so many times, and few things in life are as nice as that. This book is a consequence of a rather simple thing. Michael and I had just finished editing together a special issue of the International Forum of Psychoanalysis focused on teaching psychoanalysis. And I was thinking, what could be the next project? Our collaboration was so interesting and so fruitful. I wouldn't like to end it there. I wanted to find something else. And I was thinking about topics that could unite psychoanalytic clinical interests with research interests. And I thought crying in psychoanalysis, in psychotherapy sessions, or laughter, or boredom. And one day I remember that still very clearly. First, it was a sunny day. And when you live in Berlin, you remember every sunny day very well. And second, I thought silence. Immediately, it became obvious to me silence was everywhere, implicit in everything I was interested in. I remembered the painful experience of my analyst silences, to which I'm more thankful to him than to anything else now. I remember the beginning of my first supervision in my psychoanalytic training, where I said, I can talk all the time, I can be silent all the time, I just don't know when to speak briefly. I'm sorry, I'm still entering, people are still joining us. I thought everywhere, like the silenced female characters of Shakespeare, Stalin's attempt to silence Shostakovich, Bulgakov, and everyone else. I remembered working at the psychiatric hospital, how many patients talked about being...
Your mic is off. Alexander, your mic is off.
I don't know how that happened.
Mm.
And in the very next moment, I thought, but the idea is ridiculous. There must be 1,000 books about this. And when I asked Michael, he also said, I don't have a single one in my library, in my study. And we started searching, and we couldn't find many. There were many books about silence outside of psychoanalysis, in philosophy, in all sorts of theology or mysticism studies or spirituality, books by people who went to silent retreats and then wanted to share their experiences with us and so on. But the last book we discovered in the world of psychoanalysis was published in 1987 in French, and it was basically a reprint of classical papers from the 1950s and 60s. So we wrote a brief book proposal, and one day I gathered courage and sent it to Lou Aaron. And although I've met Lou only twice in my life, he was one of my intellectual heroes. I respect his books enormously. And it was the end of November, and I thought he'll reply the beginning of January after the holidays and everything. And he replied within 45 minutes. And he said, this is a no-brainer. You have all of the support. I'll do whatever I can so that this book is published. And that's how it all started. If he supported it, then we believed it must be important to focus. And then we wrote dozens of emails to many of you who are present here today. We thank you all enormously. This was a long journey. You were so wonderfully patient and responded to all of our inquiries and requests. And that's hugely important to see you finally in person beyond the emails and papers that we've exchanged. This was all done in a way under the auspices of the International Psychoanalytic University. I hope Professor Rode Daxa is with us. She announced she would be. Our founder here, who founded this safe space where psychoanalysts can think and work together. And our student assistants did a lot of research, looked for papers, worked on reference lists, and so on and so on. Our thank you has to be joined with some words of sadness. Unfortunately, during the process, Horst Kechele, who was supposed to contribute the chapter, got ill and passed away. And the same happened with Lou Aaron, who had promised to write the concluding chapter for the book. And even two of the contributors got very ill. One did not manage to write her paper. So the process was very long and partly very sad. I was, during the process, very unhappy, especially about my own chapters. And I thought the book should be something like when you're reading Thomas Merton or something like that, or Shakespeare or something like that, that the word about silence there should be extremely inspiring. When I read the manuscript for the first time, then I figured out, again for the first time, how much useful information, how much insight from various perspectives the book contains. And usually I'm awfully critical about my own work. I would never say this if I didn't really believe it. But really, thank you to everyone who contributed. I think the reader would need a lot of time to digest this book and learn a lot from all of the perspectives. The wider cultural perspective that gives context, then the clinical psychoanalytic one, and finally the research, which somehow gives a more solid ground. Because we're many and we're going to present many different things, I will stop here for the moment. I give the word to Michael now with the special and the greatest thank you in this context that I have, that is for you, Michael.
Yes, thank you, Alexander. I can give you a very short introduction from my side. I want you to understand that my own analysis, my own first analysis, was with a master of silence and being present at the same time. I always wanted to better understand what this was about that had touched me so deeply in my 20s and beginning 30s. Therefore, when Alexander, during one of our weekly breakfasts at IPU, nearly 3 years ago, proposed to publish a book on silence, I was enthusiastic. This was a meeting of minds as I had begun to write a paper on that topic a few weeks before. The conclusion was clear: we would make the book. We would intensify our cooperation, organize the book, cooperate with so many interesting people which are present here at the moment, and read the valuable contributions of our authors. What I do not want to go unmentioned was a not so surprising result that this time together reinforced our friendship and profession. Thank you, Alexander, for that. Now, well, it's your turn again, Alexander.
So my task is now to try to briefly introduce to you the first third of the book. That is the cultural section that initially had the basic purpose of avoiding the constant soliloquy that psychoanalysis has, to introduce the dialogue between psychoanalysis and other disciplines, see where phenomena come from into our discourse and our work, and to see how we can enrich psychoanalysis and learn from other disciplines. This part of the book has 5 chapters. The first one is written by Donna Orange, a psychoanalyst, phenomenologist, philosopher, who writes about the types of silence she can discern as a phenomenologist. I find it very interesting to think of that chapter, then Salman Akhtar's chapter about types of silence in psychoanalytic situation, and then the chapter by Heidi Levitt, who is with us thankfully today, and Zenobia Morel about what they, as empirical researchers of silence, can see as types of silence. Another 2 chapters in this part are by Professor de la Motte Huber, who wrote about music, a wonderful paper about everything I don't know anything about: Xenakis, Nono, what I would call postmodern music. And finally, by Patrick Shen, a film director whose documentary In Pursuit of Silence was one of the inspirations for this. A film I would recommend wholeheartedly to everyone. And I dreamt before Corona that we would have a book launch here at the IPU and at the beginning watch the movie. Two contributors from this section are here with us today, and they will speak about their interest in silence and what they wanted to write about. The first of them, Colum Kenny, Emeritus Professor of the Dublin City University, Professor of Communication, and the author of the book The Powers of Silence, published by Carnac Books almost 10 years ago, I think. In the book, there is a chapter on silence in psychotherapy, but we asked Colum to write about silence and its relation to religious tradition. So Colum, please.
Dankeschön. Guten Abend, Berlin. Es ist mir eine Freude, mit Ihnen aus Irland zu sprechen. Good afternoon from Bray in Ireland, which is a small town about 20 kilometers south of Dublin between the Irish Sea and the Wicklow Hills. It's a great pleasure to be with you this evening, and an honor to be invited by Alexander and Mikhail to contribute an essay to this interesting volume that we're launching this evening. So why have I, who am not a psychotherapist, an essay in this book? Let me explain. When I was young, I soon noticed that silences can function in both a positive and a negative way. I saw very clearly that some matters were not mentioned at family gatherings or in other social circumstances, in case they made people uncomfortable, or because some people just didn't wish to hear or to discuss openly a different point of view that they personally found upsetting. When I became an adult, and I worked first as a lawyer and then as a journalist, the rich texture of silences and silencing became even more obvious to me on a personal level, in civil, professional, political, and social contexts. Now, at the same time as I was learning these things, I was also discovering a different kind of silence, one that can strengthen and enable the spirit and lift the heart. Alexander has already mentioned, as well as an acquaintanceship with some Tibetan Buddhist immigrants to Europe, helped me to experience a little of the fruitful silences of meditation. There are insights that lie hidden like buried treasures within the world's great wisdom traditions and religions. Now, my professional career eventually led me to join the faculty of the School of Communications at Dublin City University. And I was, for a while at Dublin City University, the chairman of the Masters in Journalism program. But I also decided to create a course entitled Belief and Communications. And to the surprise and to some extent to the disappointment of some of my faculty colleagues, that course was popular with students. Within the course, we discussed everyday issues like the representation of religious conflict in the media. But I also explored with students how they represent to themselves or express to others spiritual ideas and inclinations, even if they don't belong to any particular religious organization or don't regard them, or even if they regard themselves as agnostic or atheistic. Then just over a decade ago, I wrote the book on silence and communications, which included some consideration of religious aspects of silence, as well as a broad range of other kinds of silences. And as Alexander has said, that was published by Carnac in 2011, and in a Korean translation in Seoul by Jules Nuram in 2016. And as a result of that, here I am. I've written a chapter here, an essay entitled Encountering Religious and Spiritual Silences. I'm hoping that perhaps you may discover something useful in the essay. If psychotherapists wish to engage in therapy or dialogue with people of a spiritual inclination, it's important to understand that silence is not just an idea or a concept, but can also be a revelatory experience and a technology of the self. Some people use silence to effect operations on their own bodies and souls, and thoughts and conduct, on their whole way of being as a transformative means of attaining a certain state of happiness or purity or wisdom. My essay, paradoxically, discusses the ineffable. The ineffable is, as you know, that which actually transcends language. I also trace the role of silence in folk music and in folk rituals and ceremonies. And I touch on beliefs about silence in ancient Egypt and Greece and India in the religious sphere. I consider the description in Hebrew scriptures of Elijah in the cave and reference Muhammad enfolded in his cloak at Hira. In discussing briefly silence in Buddhism and Christianity, I explore differences and similarities between meditation and contemplation and the meanings of those words, or the meanings given to those concepts. And I also note that dark night of the soul when one experiences in silence a sense of forsakenness. My essay ends with a few thoughts that I hope may be helpful to analysts in respect to people in crisis. To some such clients, the soul or spirit is not just an abstraction, but is understood in silence as a very real and present part of our human identity. Thank you again for being part of this volume.
Well, thank you, Colum. It was a pleasure to collaborate with you, and we're very happy that the collaboration continues in this year and new projects. And now from Ireland, we go to Warsaw, to Silvia Bonacchi, who is a linguist and a professor at the University of Warsaw, focused on research in the fields of pragma linguistics, politeness, impoliteness, and verbal aggression, and also intercultural communication. So she wrote for us a chapter about silences in language. Are they pauses? Are they breaks? Are they meaningful? Are they parts of conversation? That is what Silvia knows a lot about.
So thank you very much for the nice words. I also would like to thank you for this great work that you have fulfilled. In my contribution to this book, I tried to give, as a linguist, an overview of the forms and functions of silence in conversational exchanges in order to understand how they can be used in full awareness by psychotherapists in their work. Because psychotherapy should be a successful dialogue between patients and psychotherapists. The normal approach of linguists to silence is a bit, so let's say, logocentric. That is to say that silence is just absence of speech, because we think that the most important thing in a conversational exchange are words. In the meantime, we know also that what is not words, such as nonverbal communication or moments of absence of talk, is very important to create what we call communicative space. And my point was to show how absence of talk is fundamental for the organization of a conversation, both as part of time constructions units and as transition relevant points. That is to say, the moments where speakers and listener change their role as the result of a continuous negotiation. That is to say, which is quite banal, the speaker can speak if listener gives her, I will use the generic feminine, communicative space. Otherwise, we have overlapping and the communication failed. So it's a very delicate balance, like in a dance, that we call cooperation principle. So the point is that we have always to understand when the silence of the listener and the silence of the speaker in a conversation, in dialogue, are the result of fluency or disfluency. And in the case of disfluency, what silence can convey. So we have to interpret this silence. Let's begin from the listener. The listener is not expected to speak when the speaker speaks, but the silence of the listener is always a field silence, which occurs in field pauses. For example, we can say continuous, we can say uh-huh, mm-hmm, or it can be expressed non-verbally. For example, through facial expressions, smiling, head movements, or gaze. Field silence, the field silence of the listener signals, I'm very happy with my role, I'm happy to listen to you, my mind is with you. When the silence of the listener occurs as non-fulfillment of conversational obligations, such as, for example, not answering a question, not returning a greeting, it can be interpreted as a sign of communicative failure, and even as a withdrawal of resonance. The silence of the speaker. So, speaker normally speaks. When she doesn't speak, but she's supposed to speak or expected to speak, silence is marked. It means that it's very significant. Normally, the silence of the speaker, who should speak but doesn't speak, is mostly located in initiating tones and mostly interpreted as a refusal to start or to join the communicative exchange. This silence is a burdening silence because the listener is forced to break the silence and to start the interaction herself. It can even lead to aggression, which is shown by the listener opening with questions about her role. For example, why don't you talk? Do you want me to talk? Do I have to start talking? A total or partial silence of the expected speaker in the form of interruptions of the verbal flow, for example, hesitations, signals, breaks, self-correction, reformulations, can also convey closure, hostility, or be expression of skepticism about the success of the verbal interaction. How much place interlocutors need for a good organization of turn-taking is managed by conversational rules that every interactant should know. And in every culture, we have other rules and expectations about the length and the form of these moments of silence. In this context, I would stress the importance of knowing norms of politeness, which normally codify these rules efficiently. When silence occurs and talk is expected, how to interpret silence? In the book, there is a lot of very beautiful contributions about it. From the linguistic point of view, we can say that silence is a so-called off-record act. That is to say, it's freely interpretable. The reconstruction of the implicatures of silence is very unsure. It can be linguistic taboos. It's not allowed to speak about it. Inexpressibility, no words can express it. Incapability of verbalizing, we are not able to speak about it. Fear of their own vulnerability, we fear sanctions, or it will hurt if we speak about it. Disinterest, it's not worth talking about it, or even rejection of the interaction. I don't want to speak with you about it. So in all these cases, we have to do with a privative situation, something cannot, should not happen, and we have mostly fear. Psychotherapists walk a tightrope. Their action sometimes requires the transformation of silence into speech, and sometimes the transformation of words into silence, according to the target strategy of recovering psychological balance. In this sense, they have to develop an extremely high communicative competence, which normally is not a part of the psychotherapy training. And in this sense, I think that an exchange with linguists or with communication specialists could be perhaps useful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Silvia. This is briefly about the first third of the book. Michael will now introduce the second and the third ones.
Yes. I think we are in a situation that we all can recognize that there is much more than talking in the talking cure, much more things. And what I cannot avoid is to mention a funny example. Galata Levy, one of the prominent psychoanalysts in the States, in 2009 reported a funny experience. He had a patient who never responded after his therapist had said something. He was simply silent for half a minute or so, and when speaking, he simply changed topic. So the therapist was never informed via a feedback loop whether he had said something correct or not, nor whether he had even been heard. Sometimes the therapist even got to feeling uncertain whether he had actually spoken or not. After having endured this derealization mode for a certain time, he made up his mind to address this pattern directly. I regret that it's not reported what he spoke to his patient, but the answer of the patient is transmitted. The patient said, "I admit and go on." Perplexed, the therapist responded with something like, "You admit and go on." And quickly the patient now answered, "Yes, I admit and go on." This little exchange of the same phrase had a rhythm, spoken with groove and swing. Both suddenly felt compelled to laugh. So in a difficult dialogue format, suddenly a sort of warm cheerfulness emerged, bringing this therapy into a new mode. Not the meaning of words, it was the bodily dance-like rhythm that moved the therapeutic pair to a new level. When I read this, I thought this is a funny story, amounting to the conclusion that talking is not all that's happening during a talking cue. There's rhythm and music in it, and I think by Christopher Mahlstedt we will hear a little bit more about that. Even if the participants think that they do nothing more than an exchange of words, as Freud's formulation was in his lectures from 1916, 17. We're very happy that we could include a contribution by Elsa Ronningstam about the transformative power of silence in the clinical situation. Transformative because silencing is considered a cultural phenomenon. Salman Akhtar describes varieties of silence which come close to what Heidi Levitt and her co-author Zenobia Morrill in the research part describe. The experienced clinician and the experienced researchers share an intuition that there are classes or types of silence and that they can and should be distinguished. This conviction is shared by J. Frankl, who titled "Silence is Golden," while Aleksandar takes the opposite position that silence, of course, is a manifestation of resistance. Yes, and as he adds in his second contribution for the clinical part, there are ways of silence by traumatized people which can be distinguished because they reproduce being silenced, having lost their own voice, or were condemned not to speak because there were no ears that could be expected to be sufficiently recipient. It seems that there is a political dimension in that. Traumatized people often were not only silenced, but they were forced to speak foreign words and use a speech which was installed by perpetrators. This forced commitment has a powerful influence to hold the state of traumatically being silenced. To help patients to find and regain their own voice is reported by Margaret Boyle, Spellman, and Howard Levine as a task which is commonly addressed. And I want to add, it comes close to what we then find in the research section, where the final chapter turns to a couple in trouble, silencing and being silenced while talking together. So now, please, I ask Elsa and then Aleksandar to give a short speech.
Can you see my slides?
Yes.
And you can hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, first of all, I want to thank you so very much, both Aleksandar and Michael, for including me in this very, very important book. I got inspired to write this original article for two reasons. I had been treating a patient who, after several years, got silent in her very intense psychotherapy. And for 1.5 years, she barely spoke, or she spoke very, very infrequently. And this experience taught me a lot. And in addition, I actually come from a culture in northern Sweden, close to the Arctic Circle, where silence and its different functions were very, very present and also highly valued. There was a say, speaking is silver, but silence is gold. So that's what I grew up with. But I shall give you some brief summary of what I came to learn about all this. Silence can provide and protect space for the core self, and it can promote an inner transformation and psychological development. So there are many very significantly important functions of silence. Silence can also transform deeper inner experiences into words, and that can be verbalized, and into affects that can be felt and conveyed. And this is also very, very important with the people who have had early traumas, early silenced experiences. Transformation of the pre-verbal affect in silence is actually a very interesting and important thing which I learned from my patient whose experiences were deeply rooted in her body, as in psychophysiological compartments. So desomatization is one really important first step. Then there is the differentiation of affects, sort out the difference in fear, anger, shame, joy, to mention a few of them, which can be somatized and experienced in very, very different ways. Then it is the step from connecting the experience, the affect into a word. And that often happen internally first until it leads to an interpersonal relating. Silence can involve a transference, countertransference matrix with the projective identifications of internalized objects that can cause a tenuous balance between maintaining and raising the relationship between patient and therapist. Some says, okay, if you don't talk to me, we don't have a relationship. Others says, oh, we have a relationship that includes silence. Silence can represent a defense, a resistance that may be interpreted, but silence can also represent a protection of self-cohesiveness or hidden meaning. And this requires a very different technical approach, much more of non-verbal interaction, eye contact, attentiveness, and a gradual exploration. But silence can also serve to maintain internal control, protect a fragile self-esteem that enable avoidance of exposure, shame, fear, vulnerabilities related to early trauma, and other such very serious things. And then in this context, then I gradually got to be very interested in the many cultural meanings and functions of silence. It can be rejecting, it can be rewarding, it can serve as retreat. In my experience, cultural silence was associated with politeness, distancing, solidarity, absence of words. People enjoy themselves in silence. People grieved in silence. People got angry at each other and remained silent. And here I think we have patterns that we need to understand in very specific ways. And I have included different art from different authors, different parts of the world to symbolize this. I want to end with a poem by the Swedish poet Gunnar Ekelöf. This is one of his poetics that shows that silence speaks when words can't. It is to the silence you should listen, the silence behind the apostrophes, the allusions, the silence in the rhetoric, or in the so-called formally perfected. This is the search for an unmeaning in the meaningful and the reverse. And I think this was very guiding for me and has been in my work with patients whose silence have been important. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Elsa. That was great. Now, Aleksandar, please.
As we started thinking about individual chapters that should be in the book, there was one that we were aware had to be there, and that is a paper about how silence in psychoanalytic sessions can be a manifestation of resistance. I say must because that is the topic that most psychoanalysts wrote about, starting, of course, with Freud, and then most famously Theodor Reich, and many others wrote about it. Initially, I thought I'll take that one because it's going to be too boring for anyone of the well-renowned authors we were inviting. I wouldn't ask Jay Frankel to write about something that is almost like an essay a doctoral student could write. And then I started writing a review of what people used to say over time. And two ideas that came to my mind. I didn't come to them. And then were very little studied. Is an analyst, is a psychotherapist sometimes silent because there is a resistance in the therapist? We tend to believe that we are in a way superhuman or so humane and supporting that we would never do that. But can an analyst be silent because he or she is offended or tired or has problems in private life or whatever? And then finally, in the third part of the paper, I tried to follow an idea that is barely present in the intersubjective, in the relational tradition in the US, and that is, can the silence be the product of two minds being at a standstill, in a conflict, in a joint problem, not coming from one person, not coming from the other person, but they, as a couple, as a therapeutic couple, are in that problem. I even suggested by the end of the paper that possibly supervision in the world of psychoanalysis should sometimes be asked from couples therapists, family therapists, marriage therapists who might know more than we do about how these things travel between the two minds. Not many psychoanalysts with whom I've shared this idea in the meantime found it likable and popular. In the second paper I wrote, I focused on two different processes, on silence and then on silencing, intentional attempts to make it impossible for some people to articulate their identity, feelings, experiences, and so on. On one level, in what we call the attachment trauma. So how a person to whom a child is attached, who is the source of comfort, can become the source of horror. Can a child naturally find ways, find words to express this experience? And then what strategies can the perpetrator use to make the child silent so that no one will ever know? Then on the second level, when it comes to social trauma, when one large social group does whatever they can to eradicate, to commit a genocide, or to destroy a language or a cultural tradition so that another social group would be destroyed factually or at least psychologically. And then various forms of silencing and its consequences exist here, and various strategies to enforce this. My favorite example about the difficulty of this process is that Berlin honorably has several memorials to the victims of the Third Reich. The last one among them, the memorial to the psychiatric patients who were murdered during the Third Reich, and that's about 200,000 people, was opened in September 2014. So even where people work hard on it, it takes 69 years to admit some parts of what is going on there. So trauma and silencing go together. I now even cannot think probably about them separately. And people come to us, to psychotherapists, to ask for help and to see what can be done. How can trauma be overcome? The third part of that paper is about a possible mistake of re-traumatizing patients if we follow the Freudian doctrine all too closely and we keep being anonymous and distant and objective always with all patients at all sessions to the extent that may bring patients back through time to the actual experience when they were traumatized, physically abused, sexually abused, victims of war, this or that. And then there was no one around them who would pay enough attention, who would acknowledge and recognize the trauma, so that this trauma over time, joined by the silence, turned into a mental disorder. So these were the two contributions that challenge the idea that psychoanalysis is talking cure. Sometimes it's being silent together cure for good reasons, and sometimes it's being silent together for potentially very negative and bring potentially very negative consequences. So that's all about it in brief. Thank you.
Thank you, Aleksandar, for this contribution. In the chat, I just read someone is very thankful that we are brought these things to our ears. Yes, and I think so too. Now I have the pleasure to introduce you to the research section, and I want to start with an episode I found in the research literature. It was Elizabeth Nutt Williams who reported in 2008 that one evening she wanted to review a videotaped session that she remembered as vivid, full of quick verbal exchange. And then she writes, I was stunned to see a low-key, slow and fairly quiet one instead. I was struck by the vast difference between my experience and the recorded tape. This is a confession not often met in the literature, that there are so enormous differences what we remember from our sessions and what is possible to find out if things are recorded. So this is a very open-minded confession. Our memory is not comprehensive enough to remember all the details of a therapeutic session. Thus, tape recording for research purpose is unavoidable. More than 15 years ago, I had the pleasure to read a paper by Heidi Levitt and her colleagues about silence in psychotherapy research in 2006. Heidi, you developed a pauses inventory categorization system, abbreviated PICS, for the study of pauses longer than 3 seconds. The endpoints of this tool allow to distinguish for productive and non-productive silences, depending on what comes up after the break. What she and her group, one of them, Zenobia Moril, co-authors the contribution in the book, what she and her group found is that the type of silences thus found can statistically predict the outcome of therapy. And this was a real breakthrough. My collaborators at IPU, Florian Dreyer and Michael Franzen, and I have seen that Marie-Louise Alder is present here too. Florian Dreyer and Michael Franzen used this idea to study long pauses, longer than 30 seconds. They used conversation analysis as their method of choice and found that a pause can be considered as productive when, for instance, the patient restarts talking by either telling what one was thinking about or by metaphorizing the talk before the silence. This comes astonishingly close to what was described in J. Frankel's clinical contribution. My own study of pauses, shorter than 3 seconds, following a slip by the patient, reveal a typical pattern of repair activities based on the assumption that it takes 0.6 seconds to listen how one's own slip might be heard in the recipient's ear, and then decide for a new project of talk which takes up another 0.6 seconds. Thus, the pauses typically amount to 1.2 seconds. However, when the therapist slips, for instance, by falsely naming a patient's partner, pauses are much longer. And when the therapist repairs by producing another false naming, then serious problems of repair arise. So, slips and pauses have a meaning in itself. Anna Vatanen's study leaves the treatment room. She is interested in studying how people in everyday interaction restart their conversation. Restart their conversation after they fell in silence, which is a very often met experience you find in your own everyday interaction. You talk to somebody, then you have a pause. And what organizes who starts? And so you often find that both start in the same moment. Yeah. She has wonderful, Anna Vatanen has wonderful material for her study, and she shows convincingly the role of gaze exchanges as a starting signal to setting the machinery of talking again in motion. The body talks, and we can learn, body gazes, and we can learn that we have overlooked the voice as a so important element of talk and of the body, of course. The next study on speaking that silences shows the musicality of a couple's talk, the melody of complaints presented in musical notation by Christopher Mahlstedt, who is an excellent musician, and was a student at IPU. While I was invited as senior research fellow at the FRIAS in Freiburg by Stefan Pfänder, who is present here, who is professor of linguistics in Freiburg, we worked on this couple's talk extensively. Both Stefan, Christopher, Stefan and Christopher will give a short look into these analyses. This study addresses a new field in understanding silence while talking, which was named by Harvey Sachs as noticeable absence. And we hear that something is in the air, something that you imagine, you can grasp, and which you hear, although it is unspoken. Christopher, we are curious to listen to you.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here and to be part of the project. Thank you, Alexander. And yeah, it was a pleasure to work out that stuff. Yeah, let me begin. So sometimes you observe others talking together and you can't help. There's a strong feeling that they are talking together and many topics just relevant at the time of the talk are omitted. You have no proof for that. It's just a feeling. You know, this is a public place and people observe that they are observed, what government termed mutual monitoring. This is a relatively simple case of communicative absence. A certain topic is not talked about in the presence of strangers. Today, well, I want to let you join us together with Stefan and the introductory words of Michael in presenting you some essentials of our analysis to a couple's interaction. We called the couple Peter and Mary. Both have been widely recorded in an interview before beginning a couple therapy. The question they had to answer was, what are our most relevant problems at the time? Listening and watching the couple's dialogue, we had first of all difficulties to understand what their problem was. Though they talked a lot, we felt that important things were noticeably left out. Let me shortly summarize a few things. From the first 90 seconds of the video with Peter and Mary, we learn that they lived together for 16 years without having talked very much about relevant things. Peter feels too much controlled by Mary. Contributing to the task to talk about most relevant problems, he tells an example of the lemon pie he lately ate, telling Mary that he liked it. She's sour about this. She often baked a lemon pie, and Peter never liked it because the lemon pie tastes sour. This recent lemon pie was baked by Sabine. No, by Jacob, he corrects himself. Mary complains that Peter obeys so often to what others advise him to do or how things are. It is she who wishes to be his counselor. She mocks him, quoting what his father or his mother have said to him, introducing his objections in a quotation by the generic "yes, but no" phrase introduction. What we later understood was she suffers from feeling without influence, but her attacks make him to build up stronger walls of defense, which stirs up her attacks. Thus, both are caught in a circular pattern. But let's go step by step. Listening to the interaction, I was struck by the high degree of, let me say, musical components like shift of volume, rhythm, and pitch of voice. I felt much was expressed by these dimensions, but relevant things were left out and not being expressed explicitly. I give you an example how my approach was. Here you can see a transcription I did of the little sequence of the couple's interaction. It's not written like you do it normally. It's neither a conversation analyst transcription, but it's the transcription like it's music. That's how I try to gather the music of their interaction. What you can see here, okay, let us listen to this little sequence.
Ja, aber Floris hat gemeint das. Nein, aber mein Papa hat gesagt das. Nee, Mama hat gemeint.
Auf meinem Kopfhörer auch nicht.
Ja gut, dann gut.
Yes, I repeated. Mary said yes, but Felix has suggested that. No, but my daddy has said that. No, mom has suggested. Then Peter drops in and saying, I don't listen to my dad. She corrects herself, okay, well, your mother, and then Peter laughs. I try to prove my transcription by playing the alto saxophone to what I transcribe. Let us hear how the music of the interaction now sounds. All right, that was already the last audio example. It doesn't matter. Then you can, well, what you heard was already a musicalization with the piano, trying to make the lines more hearable in their harmony. Let me shortly describe what we can see. Each of Mary's utterances that are taken together, a three-part list, but without a typical closure component, were shaped by a wide ambitus, a loud voice, and an inner structure shaped by dissonant intervals, the so-called tritones, expressing her anger about Peter's way of defending himself and refusing her lemon pie, or let's say her wish to have an influence on him. The musical gestalt of the contours, the end of each list items can be heard like a musical cadence, especially the third one can be heard as close, conclusive, assertive, and reinforcing on the other. Joining linguistic terms, one could regard this as musical generalist completer. We can assume that there is a shared epistemic knowledge. Both know what the quoted and silenced persons has said. Peter's interactional answer is performed with a slight laid-back feel, changing the rhythmic pattern by slowing down to 8-note triplets and intonating sharply different pitches. Though it sounds as if he is picking up Mary's riff, the list and displaying it now very simply as a cadence movement from 1 to 5 to 1. By setting up a contrast in pitch and rhythm while saying, I don't listen to my dad, in an artificial sounding tone of voice, we must hear his repair as disaffiliative. Furthermore, he is the one who claims deontic authority, like a lawyer or defendant who is dismembering the list. The sequence is followed by silent. Mary waits for Peter to take an effective stance, which he does not. We call this type of silencing as non-delivery. The three orders of intersubjectivity, as Stefanovic and Koski described, focusing on effective, epistemic, and deontic aspects, are not well aligned. They are in disharmony.
Thank you, Christopher. Fine. We got an impression of your work. Very well, thank you. Now the last contribution by Stefan Pfänder.
Thank you. So first of all, let me say thank you. I'm grateful to collaborate as a linguist, and much of what I'm going to say is due to this wonderful walks along the Spree in Berlin together with Michael Buchholz and the members of his team. In the case of silence, especially my dialogue with Florian Dreyer. I'm working as a linguist on silencing in the context of survivors of forced labor and concentration camps, and at the moment a lot about moments of silence in couples interactions, of loving couples who love each other but not right now, where silence is some kind of Alexander's resistance in moments of quarrels. And I will not again talk about our joint article, but as I'm the last in the line, I thought I could talk about a wonderful book which I contributed to, but which I now read as a final achievement. And let me share 8 brief, short thoughts that I found when reading the book. 1. Silence is spatial. We may speak of silence not as a space to be filled, but a substance filling space itself. Silence may fill a church, a room, a forest, but also a moment of talking or a talking cure session. Silence is inherently spatial. Thought number 2, silence as inherently temporal. If silences were not temporal, they would be imperceptible. We could not perceive silence if not temporally. Despite much prior research, Michael's and Alexander's compilation, our articles show that this temporal dimension is much more about subjective perception and less about any objective measure of time. So how long a pause has to be a noticeable absence depends so much on the contexts, on the rhythm of speech, and on how the two interact. Thought number 3, silence and speech. Silence and speech are inseparable, inescapably intertwined. The two belong together. We thus recognize silence only because it is framed by speech and vice versa. Freely citing Karl Bühler in a letter to his wife Charlotte, the two of them a lot working both in linguistics and psychology, of course. Karl Bühler had it that silence is an island in the ocean of words. And what would be an ocean without the islands you can swim to? Mm-hmm. Thought number 4. Does the absence of words and sentences equal the absence of communication? The Oxford Dictionary, as Silvia quoted it in her article, says yes. And we would say no. Silence is a noticeable absence of words, yes, but it is intrinsically communication. Communication, as Silvia shows in so fine detail, and it was a pleasure for me to get to know someone I didn't know before, so we might get in contact. Silvia, silence is communication, and communication is so much more than words. Problem is that many linguists up to date don't believe that. We might want to change that. 5, bodily expression. Communication is more than words. Communication is about imagination, common ground, shared knowledge, shared stances, shared feelings. Only because there are no words does not mean that the current speaker, now the current silencer, if you wish, does not move. If he or she silences, that is, does not speak, does not want to speak about something, she might change the rhythm of his or her bodily movement so as to hinder the partner of speaking about it, moving fast as to not allow for turn-taking. And thought number 6, quite the opposite, but still significant, is when silence comes over me like dawn. One of the articles cites an important paper by Thomas Fuchs and Sabine Koch in Frontiers, published in Frontiers 2014, with a wonderful subtitle of embodied affectivity, moving and being moved. If silence, as I said, like dawn falls, I'm also moved, literally. The hearer, the listener may perceive, not my words, they're absent, but he or she may perceive my shrinking body posture, or my head and eye gaze movement into the off, or tears in my eyes. In any way, in moments of silence, we are both, speaker and listener, metaphorically moved, or maybe moved, left thus to our imagination, but not free-floating imagination. We both stop speaking, but think about the same event that was just reported or narrated, and the corresponding emotions. 7. Silence and the words before and after. Silence in speech becomes meaningful thanks to what has been said just before, but also thanks to what the speaker was about to say, yet suspended. And the listener, who, as we know from the psycholinguistic research, especially the psycholinguistic research, sadly, outside of Germany, done by many who had to leave Germany during and after World War II, the listener is way ahead of the speaker, anticipating, projecting what is to come. So we both, in moments of silence, are still hanging at the words before and in the anticipation of what was to come. And thus, moments of silence, as many articles in a way or another show, moments of silence can be more of an encounter than while talking, because we both hang on the words said just before. And which is more, as Elsa shows so convincingly in her article, when looking not at the silence alone, but the words right after the silence, we can learn how silence can help to re-experience an event and help to transform the experience into words, as Elsa has it, after the silence. During the silence, we re-experience some of the event and then maybe find a way to communicate the difficult to communicate event. And the last and 8th thought, in a nutshell then, why care about silence in therapeutic interaction or in interaction overall? As Michael said in the very beginning today, he knew a master of silence. And the characteristics he gave, Michael, if I understood you correctly, is that this master of silence was not just silence, he was being present during the silence. Michael nodding. So silence is maybe an enhanced moment of presence, if well mastered. The question was, for my last and 8th thought, thus, why care about silence in interaction? I invite you, just before the end of my brief intervention, I invite you to share 8 seconds of silence. If you hear the sound, the 8 seconds will start, and if you hear the same sound, the 8 seconds are over. Before I will do this experiment, if you allow for it, just before giving not my answer to the question, but in a way our answer to the question, which is in a way very much based on Bergman's and Acheson's thoughts that are quoted throughout the book as well, and who gave quite converging answers to the question of why we as linguists, psychologists, therapists, or simply as human beings who love to talk, why we should care about silence in interaction. Thank you. Acheson, 2008, concludes, and I couldn't agree more, that we should care about moments of silence and interaction because these moments clearly contribute to the meaning making in interaction. How this works is spelled out in all contributions to this wonderful book and in an early and very insightful paper by Jörg Bergman, cited in some of the papers in this book. And I want to end with a citation by Gunnar Ekelöf, which Elsa already cited. So I just take up one line she also already cited. It is to silence that we should listen. Thank you.
So it's hard to speak now again. But as we all know, thank you, Stefan, for this final contribution. And after we have heard so many interesting words about silencing, it's time for the audience.
Michael, I'm sorry to interrupt, but it must be a privilege to hear from Heidi as well.
Sorry. Sorry, that's my failure. Forgive me, please. Yeah. Okay, of course, yeah.
So I'm pleased to talk a little bit about our chapter, which was in the research section, and in which we focused on the experiences that clients have during silence. And I come to this work through an interest in an earlier interest in narrative, and finding that the more I explored how narrative is present within psychotherapy discourse, the more I was drawn to what was not being said in the narrative. And so I started to look at the literature to see, well, what are we learning about, in our psychological studies, and found that historically the way research was conducted on silences was that we would count and tabulate the number of silences that occurred within a session or a period of time. And this produced a very contradictory and confusing literature, because for every study that we conducted that examined and found silences to be correlated with positive outcome and alliance, there was another study that found silence to be correlated with the negative outcomes and negative alliance. And it was very difficult to make sense of this literature, which led me to think that it might not make sense to see silence as a homogeneous kind of variable, which I think is very well reflected in this volume. And maybe there are different kinds of processes that are happening in silent moments in therapy that are quite distinctive. So I began by conducting a qualitative study, interviewing clients, and asked them to watch with me silences in their therapy and talk about what was happening for them in those moments. And from that process developed a typology in which we found that some moments were indeed very positive and incredibly important in the therapy progress. Moments like when clients were experiencing an emotion deeply and contacting that emotion. Moments when clients were symbolizing experiences that they haven't had language for before and shaping that language. Moments where clients were being reflexive and analyzing their experience, identifying patterns, And these were very positive moments, and therapists did well by supporting clients to sustain those silences and see, what they came to from those silent moments. Silent moments. Other silences were more neutral, like when clients were remembering a date or an event or a detail to relay, or when they were switching between topics. And other silences were more obstructive, like silences where clients disengaged or withdrew emotionally because something was very painful or threatening. Or silences where the attention of the client switched from their own internal experience to the therapist because they were confused by something the therapist was doing, or they objected or found or were critical of something that the therapists were doing. And these silences could be obstructive in the moment and if they were not resolved, but also could become quite productive if therapists were able to invite an exploration of what was happening in those moments. And so we found these really different types of silences that were happening, these productive, obstructive, and more neutral silences. And this led to the development of a process measure, the pausing, which Michelle mentioned before, the pausing inventory categorization system, the PICS, where we looked at the discursive cues that came before and after these silences to help people be able to identify what was happening inside the client during different moments, from either looking at transcripts or listening to recordings of psychotherapy. And I was so pleased that Zenobia Morrill, who was at the University of Massachusetts, Boston with me, but now at Yale School of Medicine, joined me to pull together all of the studies that have been conducted using this measure together in this chapter. And so in the chapter, you'll see that we review the PICS itself and provide different clinical examples. And then we talk about the different forms of validation for the measure, like we have high client inter-rater reliability as well as client rater reliability, which is pretty rare for process measures. We also have an empirically based sampling system that can allow psychotherapy researchers to rate just a random half of the psychotherapy material. And we've shown that you can still get a reliable sense of what's happening in the therapy by using the system. And also cultural validation, that the PICS has been used in studies now across 9 different countries and in different languages. And so this provides some cultural validation, as well as a beautiful study by Marcela Guzman Sanchez in Chile, really focused on the cultural validation of the PICS. And so then the rest of the chapter, I'm not going to go into the results, but describes all the different findings from these studies. So there's different intensive case studies using the PICS, comparisons of good and poor studies and clinical trials, studies looking at how silence can be quite different depending on theoretical orientation that's being used, and looking at different processes like specific silences, like disengaged silences and depressed mood and negative self-evaluation. And so the chapter is really focused on pulling together all these different findings, and you'll find the details of these studies in the book. But just to say that we were both very pleased to have contributed to such an important volume alongside so many impressive silence researchers, and to really also enjoying this experience of presenting together and this sort of development of a silence research community. Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi. Thank you, Heidi, for this contribution. And I want to invite you all now to bring to us your ideas while we presenters have time to be silent now and listen to your ideas and comments and questions or whatever you have. Please. And Masha, you will do the organization, yeah? Okay.
Yes. So among the people that we have in the audience today is the director of Stillpoint Spaces, Dr. Aaron Balak. So he will start with some of his notes and comments and questions. And for any of you who would like to ask a question out loud, I would like to offer an option that you unmute yourself if you can see, let's say, the screen, and if someone else might want to talk and you think it's a good moment. This will offer us, let's say, a more spontaneous approach to the Q&A. If it becomes too busy, there is an alternative way. You could raise your hand. There are 3 dots in the bottom right corner of your screen, and there you will be able to raise your hand on Zoom. You could also raise your physical hand as long as you have your camera on, and we will be able to see you and unmute you. There are people who have been writing comments and questions in the chat. I have my eyes on that, and at some point I will bring up and read some of them out loud. If any of the people who has decided to write their question first would like to speak up, this is of course also welcome.
Thank you so much, Masha. I'm going to stay very uncharacteristically brief and just limit my comments to a really big and hearty thank you to all of the contributors who came today, and how beautifully everything was handled and moved on. Masha, thank you so much too. These are very difficult things to manage on Zoom, and this team just really passed everything off so beautifully. And I'm really grateful also for the interdisciplinary nature of the book, which really fits so closely into Stillpoint's vision, which is how we can think about psychoanalysis and other disciplines with clinicians and non-clinicians to better understand our world together. And it really feels like we did that today. So thank you so much to all the contributors and the contributors that aren't here. Thank you so much to Masha, who organized all of this so beautifully, and she will be in touch with you afterwards, because I think you can get access to the book also at a discount. And just before I pass on, I just want to note that the central paradox here, to me anyway, is that we're using language to understand silence. And this is a very fundamental piece of the psychotherapeutic and psychoanalytic project on its own, the curiosity about what might be going on in somebody's mind, and projection and transference all lives in the silence of the therapist, and understanding and recognizing the world of the patient lies in silences as well. And another layer, particularly today, that most people sharing contributions to this book are using language to understand silence in a language that isn't their own, and are gracefully sharing with us in a second or third language also, which I think was brought up in one of the earlier presentations. So I'm grateful as a mostly single language English speaker, the capacity and generosity of people to contribute in this way, and how that lives in the world as well. Just before I pass on to the audience, because I want to make sure that there's all the rest of the time is for questions, answers, and comments from those of you who were gracious enough also to come on a Saturday night when there's so many other options these days to spend your Saturday evening. When we started doing online therapy through Stillpoint before the pandemic happened, we carried out our own research in how that was working. And one of the primary things that arose in that research is that silence isn't managed particularly well online, that when you're in a consulting room with a patient, silences can be held much better than they can be held on Zoom or Skype or whatever video conferencing you're using. And now that all of psychotherapy has moved online, there's some pretty serious consequences for that. And additionally, the way we're meeting now, we have the great advantage of having all the speakers here today, which we may not have done in a face-to-face session, but we're doing it on Zoom, which also has an inhibitory effect for silences. So one of the things that we've been trying to do in the therapeutic situation, mediated by video conferencing and in our events online, is to kind of give people permission, as Stefan did in his final presentation, to take some silence. Which means I'm going to shut my mouth now, and don't feel that you have to rush to comment or ask or put your hand up. Maybe take a few minutes to let all of these very rich interdisciplinary different angles of information to saturate yourself, and then ask that question and make that comment. And as Masha said, if you are of the more gregarious, extroverted variety like myself, feel free to flap your hands in the air and let us hear your voice. If you're more on the introverted side or on the shy side, do feel free to put it in the chat, and Masha will keep an eye on that, and she will be the voice on your behalf. So thank you all very much for being here tonight, and I'm going to mute my mic now.
So Ode Langlois, we have your microphone on. I wonder if you would like to ask a question or say something. Or maybe it's just an accident. Okay, I assume maybe it's just technical. Yeah.
There's Elsa. There's Elsa. There's Elsa raising her finger.
Yes, yes.
Yes. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah. There was just one more thought that I came to realize. I worked on integrating images to the different aspects of silence, pieces of art and so. And I think that that is another very important thing, how to integrate the visual images and sensations to make meaning of silence, or set an atmosphere of silence. And I just I forgot to sort of comment on my efforts there to capture something beyond words, and that there are many layers and dimensions in addition to word and verbal interaction.
Stefan, I wonder if I have seen your hand at some point. So
No.
at the moment you're unmuted.
No, I'm just Italian by descent, so I'm always.
Okay, we have Barbara. I will ask to unmute in the newest Zoom update. I can't unmute myself, but I can ask to unmute. Perfect.
Okay. Am I okay? I'm in Toronto. I'm a psychotherapist, and I want to thank everyone for an amazing talk. And I just wanted to bring up an article I just wrote. It's my first publication that's going into Canadian Nurse, of all things. It's written for nurses and people that are spending time with people at the end of life as they're dying, which so many nurses, unfortunately, are having to do these days. And I wrote an article based on the work of Daniel N. Stern. I forget the book now, but psychoanalyst. His work with infants and mothers about nonverbal communication and how we start out in that lush place of nonverbal before symbols, and at the end of life, we tend to go back to that place. I worked as a massage therapist also for 25 years with war veterans at the end of life. And the article is about using gaze and touch and, you know, the things that we already know, you know, just reminding the nurses that we have all of these skills already that we sort of lost when our life got put into words and symbols, and that we can go back to that place and meet people. And that when you're staring at a baby, a baby is staring at you, they don't have to stare, they can look away, they can close their eyes. And the same thing for somebody that's dying. They want to make connection, and they want to use other things and put aside the words and just to really connect, which we can do very, very well without words. So I just wanted to add that, is that we know how to communicate without words already. That's the first thing we learn. That's our first communication. And it can also be the last. Okay.
Barbara, can you send a draft of your paper?
Sure, I had to, you know, I had all sorts of mirror neurons and oscillators and all sorts of things in the original, and it all got sort of taken out.
Yeah, fine.
But I can send it to, I don't know where to send it to, but.
Send it to Masha and she will hand it over. Yeah?
Yes, you can send it to me.
Yeah, it's written for care workers and nurses.
I wonder if this might be a good moment. I'm going to read 3 questions from the audience, and then perhaps I would ask the panelists to maybe take notes if they would like to comment on something in particular. So I'm going to read all 3, and then we can tackle on different aspects of what is being asked. I'm interested in the power dynamics at play in use of silence. I recently came across the idea that a person to whom you cannot speak your truth is your oppressor. Your idea of silence as self-defense or avoidance is interesting, Elsa. And then a quote from Elsa: "Silence speaks where words can't." The second question: I wonder if the book discusses the silence that takes place after a session. Do therapists prefer to be silent in the few minutes between patients? Do patients who take time to transition after a session before they go back in their life benefit more of therapy than patients who don't? And then a third one: yes, please speak further regarding applications of teletherapy.
I can say something briefly about the second one. From, so to say, a natural experiment. My analyst changed offices a couple of times during my analysis that lasted several thousand years. And at one moment, after walking to and from for about 20 minutes, his office was literally across the street from where I used to live. So it took me 20 seconds to get there. And the sessions before that were significantly more meaningful, I believe, because of the time, while walking in silence, not returning to social relationships and obligations I would usually have, I still was digesting it. So I don't have a conclusion, but that's just one tiny example.
Okay, Colum?
Yes, in relation to the first question, it's very interesting, the idea that the person to whom you cannot speak is your oppressor. I would just qualify it slightly because I think it's important to enable people to speak. And therefore I would say the person to whom you think you cannot speak or you fear you cannot speak is your oppressor, but you can always speak. There may be extraordinary consequences to speaking, including your annihilation, but in a sense, part of the function of dealing with silence is helping people who have been silenced to find ways of expressing themselves and not internalizing it perpetually. Now, there are realistic limits to that, of course. In real life, it may be extremely dangerous, but there are often circumstances in which people feel grossly inhibited because they don't have the language to speak. They don't have the example. We have had a report in Ireland recently about the treatment of women, single mothers in mother and baby homes in the 1940s and 1950s. And many of them were greatly oppressed and didn't articulate their views. But it wasn't simply fear, it was also because they didn't have a language within which to understand their own experience, never mind actually express it to others. So I think we need to frame these questions even in a sort of constructive fashion and know that there is a way forward to people in that sense.
I've seen Heidi.
I'd just like to add to that because I think that's a really lovely point. And I know in the literature on different kinds of oppression, there's a lot of talk about also internalizing oppression. And so it may be that someone is not speaking not necessarily because the other is oppressing, but because they've just internalized oppression to such a degree that they feel that expression is futile or dangerous for them. So there could be reasons even outside of, you know, and I think to some extent that's what you're sort of qualifying, where it may not actually be the oppressor, but just the incredible internalization of oppression can be silencing, regardless of who's around you or if anyone's around you at all. I wanted to also ask, put a request, which is that I was invited to and have agreed to conduct a meta-analysis on the research literature on silences. And so I'd be really thrilled if, I think this is a great group to invite, if people have research that they've conducted on silences that they would be willing or interested in sharing. And I can I'll put my email address in the chat. Thanks.
Thank you. Stefan, yeah?
Yeah, I would love to answer to Josephine Ender's question, if that is okay, or start answering. Josephine, could you show yourself? She might not be there anymore. Just wondering, because I thought it is a good question she puts out there. She asks, is there a physical way to understand and synchronize through silence, even if, like in Zoom, sometimes it's not possible to see the body language of someone else? I really don't have an answer, just some experience to share. And I think this is an important question also for teletherapy. I'm of course not capable speaking about, but I would be interested in knowing more about it. I have the experience of many of my teaching at university, which was supposed to be about body language and silence and things like that. And now I have to do it via Zoom. And all the exercises I planned were kind of difficult. We made one experience I wanted just briefly to share. That is that are we able to synchronize in moments of silence if we don't see the other? We just switched off all our cameras, but, which is not usually done, the inverse is always done, we did not mute ourselves. So we put on the mics, did not see each other, and shared moments of silence. You can hear the breathing. You can even kind of feel the other in what is supposed to be, again, citing Karl Bühler, the Körpertastbild, whatever that might be in English. You can kind of feel how the other is there, present or not so present. And not to stay with the intuition, we tried turn-taking without seeing each other. Because it is in turn-taking that we have all these kinds of long, short, and other pauses, lapses and gaps and whatnot, and tried self and other selection and turn-taking at a high speed and at a low speed without seeing each other. So synchronizing in taking turns without seeing the other. And admitting for short and long pauses, just changing the conditions in this experiment. And we learned that this is quite possible. So that the conclusion would be that yes, Josephine, we could synchronize through silence if it's not possible to see the body language of someone else, if we learn to listen to silence. And I'm again with Elsa and the Swedish author. I wonder if this is true in teletherapy, if synchronization in silences is even possible in therapy via Zoom. There might be experiences out there.
But Stefan, this was not a proposal to test this hypothesis just now, or was that your idea?
No. I was asking. Just wondering. Okay, just answering Josephine's question.
Yes, we have Silvia.
Yes, I wanted just to join this very interesting, essential topic, because I think that we should learn how to listen, because we all learn how to speak, and we speak a lot. I speak the whole time, but I don't think that we really have learned how to listen. And our way to listen is very tied with very clear signals. It's not fine grained, yes. And so perhaps that will be the challenge for this new period where we can't share the space, just to have a more fine-grained capability of listening. Just this.
Thank you, Silvia. I would like to use the moment and read the two questions that have arrived.
Elsa raised her finger.
Excuse me.
Elsa?
Yes. So I've asked you to unmute now.
I want to broaden a little of our therapeutic strategies and thinking here. At least here in the United States, for instance, dog and pet therapy has become very popular. And there you are dealing with a way of relating that are beyond words many times. And where you can stimulate and activate a symbolization that can be extremely building and healing in many ways. And similar things belong to Tai Chi, meditation, and other types of interactions between body-mind that I have come to see from a broader sense outside the pure psychoanalytic, psychotherapeutic interaction that can have very constructive function. So just wanted to add that. Similarly with art therapy also.
So maybe I could shortly just read these two questions, and then we're happy to have more questions from the audience before we close for tonight. So the first one is, I wonder about the connection between silence and social media. I have experienced impatience increasing within societies, the various cultural societies I have observed so far. And I see that creeping into the therapy room wherein clients are less tolerant to silences. I wonder if the impulsivity with social media is affecting how tolerant clients are with silences in the room. The second question. Can one of the practicing psychoanalysts please give an example of a silenced, traumatized, coerced patient and how he or she experienced their patient's silence, and how they could find a way out of this silence or come to a different silence perhaps? Sorry for mistakes, non-native English speaker here.
Heidi, could you show up? Yeah.
Yeah, I can give a little bit of a sense of working with difficult patterns that we've seen in terms of working with difficult kinds of silences. I think the first thing that we work to teach our students to do is to think about the different types of silences, because again, some kinds of silences can be very productive, whether the person has a history of trauma or not. And if they're engaged in something that's productive and beautiful, where they're symbolizing or accessing feelings, you would, as a therapist, want to just work to continue that. But I'm guessing that what this person is asking about is about more what we would call obstructive silences, where the person is shut down or withdrawn or pulling away from their experience or from the therapy itself. And in those contexts, what we've seen as most helpful that therapists do, this is not though specific to psychoanalysis, but really across therapies, is when therapists can draw clients' attention to the silent process. What's happening in this moment for you? This seems like there's something important happening, you know, and inviting the client to attend to what's happening inside. Can you notice the processes inside of you? Notice what's going on for you, and then see if they feel comfortable, you know, after they've had a bit of time to notice it, to put some words to it or to express just even the process of that, the difficulty of expression or the enormity of whatever is happening in that silent process, which could be different kinds of experiences of threat or withdraw or concern about the therapist. So those are some patterns that I notice is just from our research has been drawing the attention to the silence and then giving an invitation to the client to come forward and describe in pieces even what might be happening in those moments so that it can be unfolded in the sessions.
Thank you very much.
Can I? I would like to add to that. That's a very important thing. Psychoeducation has been useful, I found, specifically with people who are struggling with underlying shame and fear, and where the silence really has a very important organizing, structuring, protective effect. And to sort of talk about the many functions, the many associations to silence, and that it takes its time to open up, and it has to be gradual, and so that can be very helpful. And to put the shame aspect on the table, it's sometimes shame, silence can be very helpful to handle shame.
Mm-hmm.
May I say something about the first question about social media, perhaps,
mm-hmm.
And silence? I think on the one hand, certainly social media can add to the amount of noise in the general ambience in which we move. And there is an issue around the right to silence. Professor Stuart Sim and others have written about this insofar as it's a commercial other form of attack on the individual, an attempt to control them by colonizing every space with commercial and other messages. Then there is an issue here about our right to retain silence. When we go out into the commercial world, into shopping areas or into streets, the extent to which we can be protected against other people imposing noise on us and messages on us, and that's a very real issue. On the other hand, I think social media is just part of the general disturbance, which silence can be a valuable tool to counter. There's nothing, as for those who have an even fundamental experience of meditation, there's no noisier thing than one's own mind. And the chatter of one's mind as one observes this is extremely disturbing, and no less disturbing in many ways than social media. And so we can cope with it, and we can use silence as a useful way of building up our own reserves in response to all of the noise around us. And in some ways, I think if some of the world religions that we have in the West spent a little more time concentrating on the values of those traditions of meditation and contemplation as a way of strengthening the individual in the world in the face of those forces, they would be doing a lot more valuable than they are sometimes by talking too much about issues.
I would like to say just that I haven't read the comments that were actually expressions of gratitude. However, I will save the chat and then I will share it with panelists afterwards. Maybe one more sentence. If anyone of you is interested in sharing your thoughts further, please join the Still Point Spaces community that I mentioned in the beginning. It's a place which is a social media for the psychologically curious and mental health professionals. We would be happy to continue the conversation. I've pasted it in the chat. Someone has just started drilling in the neighborhood, so you might not hear from me in the following 3 minutes. However, I would like to ask the panelists, and especially Professor Buchholz and Professor Dimitrijevic, if they would like to say some closing words.
I can only say thank you. It was a pleasure to have you here. It was a pleasure to listen to your ideas. It was a pleasure to hear you silenced while we were contributing. And I hope that our book and this launch will inspire you to work further on these topics. Thank you so much.
Yes, I agree. Thank you, everyone. We feel especially encouraged given that we have discovered the book was read by one person. This is Stefan. He read the book from the beginning to the end. So we feel encouraged and we will work more on our new projects.
Yes.
Thanks, everyone, for everything.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.